You're listening to Backbench Drivers. I'm your host, John Lawson, and joining me this week for the first time, I have Owen from the Colonial Pride Review, and he is actually a Brit himself, but he has focused a lot in recent history on Australian history, and that's why I've got him on the podcast today to discuss Australia's history, Britain's history, and where those two connect. That might be obvious to some, which is colonisation and how the British colonised Australia and turned it into the society that it is today, or at least began that process. And in recent times, this is a process which has become criticised a lot. It's come under attack from particularly the left wing of politics and academia. But today we're going to go through and we're going to examine colonialism in the Australian context, but perhaps more broadly as well, and hopefully knock down some of the myths that stand about the process and assert that it was actually, in some ways, it was a good thing. Maybe at the end we'll reach that conclusion. But welcome to the podcast, Owen, and how have you been?
I am very well, and thank you. I'm very excited to be here. I'm very excited to talk about Australian history. I have a great passion for Australian history. Maybe a tad nervous. I feel like I'm coming into Australian people's zone as a bit of an outsider, but I also think that's actually important. It's like Greek history. Lots of people who are not Greeks have opinions on Greek history. Australian history doesn't get enough of that outside discussion, outside input, whereas it should be. Australian history is good enough to warrant that, to warrant interest, and I hope I'm going to make that case in this video.
Yeah, I'm sure you will. It's not really something to even be nervous about because so few Australians even know their own history, unfortunately. And the little history that they do know is oftentimes incorrect or completely fallacious. It's written by left-wing academics, generations of them, and has just been completely caricatured beyond recognition in some cases. But hopefully we can correct that a little bit today. Maybe we can dive a little bit into where your interest in Australian history began, Owen. I saw that you made, I believe, 2 videos on the topic, and that's where we first interacted. However, did your interest begin before that, and what led you to making the videos?
Okay, I've always, since a teenager, had an interest in the history of the British Empire. But actually, you read a lot of general histories of the British Empire written by British historians. Australia is kind of passed over, actually, in favor of Africa and India, North America. Those are it's as if, and Australia's just by the by. It's as if you go out to do your grocery shopping and by the by, you pick up a can of Coke. Well, the grocery shopping is India and Africa, and Australia is just a can of Coke. Like, it just kind of happens. It's an aside to the main story. But then last year, I saw in the lead up to Australia Day, so Australia Day this year, that there was going to be protests about it, and that got me thinking. Does Australia, do they warrant this level of opposition, this hate? And from that, I decided, well, you know what? I'll do a video. I decided I'll do a video on Australia Day, but I made that decision before I knew a great deal of details. And then I did a big, deep dive into the subject. I started studying and I found, wow, this is actually a phenomenally interesting story that warrants focus, warrants attention. And from that, I developed a passion for it. But in particular, I discovered that Australian history seems to have very few friends. I found it actually remarkable in a lot of Australian history books. Geoffrey Blainey, John Hurst, these are prominent Australian historians. They both mentioned that as academics, their students often complained that Australian history was boring. Okay, so this doesn't have some of the features that maybe Australians maybe want by comparison with, say, British history or American history. It's not born for a revolution. It's not a civil war. The only coup d'etat in Australian history is named after an alcoholic drink. I think that's a plus, but other people might disagree. And so I found that not only that, there's a level of disinterest from the British side, perhaps on the Australian side. At least this is what these people told me, these historians. Then there's also animosity. Okay, great animosity. This very popular word now, decolonization, decolonizing academia, decolonizing history, decolonizing everything. It doesn't mean what you think the word might mean. It's like a cultural attack on our people. And so between indifference and hostility, there's no one standing up for Australian history. And yet, as I read about it, I realized someone should stand up for it. And also, you mentioned people have been against criticizing Australian history, left-wing academics, or for generations. It goes really right back to the beginning. actually, what I learned is the earliest history of Tasmania by John West, reverend and politician in Tasmania, in Van Diemen's Land, and then in Tasmania, as it then became known. He from that very beginning, there's a great hostility to elements of the Australian story, starting with convicts, then with the relations with the Aboriginals, then with subsequent generations more focusing on the negative influence of Britain and British culture. British culture itself is at fault. That the whole concept of colonialism is wrong. And then more recently with the ideologies of multiculturalism, the leftism we live under, there's just never not been a whole lot of people standing up for what actually, I hope I can argue in this video, is one of the most remarkable national stories around that has lessons and should be inspiring to all people, to British people. But I think British people should know about it because it's a remarkable story that we're involved in. I don't say that to take it away from Australians. Yeah, this of course it's Australia's national story, but the story begins with Britain and with British characters, and they made some remarkably good decisions and took some good actions and had good results, and they deserve to be remembered. And in fact, even if you don't like everything they decided to do, it's still a remarkable historical story. And so, then Westerners generally, I mean, you don't have to be French to appreciate French history, or German to appreciate German history. There's something in Australian history, I think, for all of us.
Yeah, the unfortunate reality of what you've described, where we have the Malays coming from one side of the population, those who are disinterested in our history, and the animosity coming from the other side, which is invested in investigating and writing books about our history, has sort of resulted in a population that is unprimed to actually defend their country and their history. Because, of course, those two things are related. If you believe that your country has a corrupt or evil past, you're going to be very much dissuaded from defending your country in the present or into the future and defending what it traditionally has been if you think that that tradition is one of massacre, genocide, and looting of natives. So by defending our history and by learning about it, I don't even mean defense in a partisan sense. I also mean, even if you learn about it in the truth of what it is, looking back at the historical record without all of the ideological baggage that has been attached since then, I think you'll discover that our history is actually, it is a great history. And I just wanted to touch on another thing, which is, you said that you don't want to take Australian history away from Australians and give it to the UK. But I'd say that it's very important that Australians, rather than looking at our country in such an isolated bubble, which is sort of the way that it is taught to us, that the world began in 1788, we should actually extend our tradition and our, I guess, our connection back to England and back to Britain's history and make that part of our own and see ourselves as a continuation of that tradition and hopefully a perfection of that tradition. If we were to write our country, I believe that's heading down the wrong track, but if we were to write our country, we could then become the fulfillment of the British tradition, hopefully, and raise to higher heights. There was a poet that said that described Australia in one of his poems. It was an Australian poet as a New Britannia in the southern land, or in an unknown land, something along those lines. And that's sort of the
Yes.
vision that I have, and many others have, many other Australian nationalists or conservatives have for our country, which is that we should become a New Britannia in another land. And so that means that we need to connect our short history back to the long history of the British Isles and really the rest of Europe as well. And we should see ourselves as a continuation of that and as a part of that, despite our geographical distance. Did you have anything to add,
Absolutely.
Owen?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I don't believe in isolated history that way at all. And speaking as an Englishman, one of Welsh origins, in fact, I take very seriously English history in an insular sense, British history more widely, European history, and even I know this is very globalist and cosmopolitan, but there is a certain sense in which it's world history as well, and it is all connected, and it is all part of a. There is a place for a human story as well, and where you have respect for the other side sometimes in our interactions, and whether negative or positive. Australian history isn't intelligible only from 1788, of course. In fact, it's actually more necessary to understand British history and context of Britain at the time Australia was created, because a remarkable feature of Australia actually, compared to many other colonies, is the input of Britain. That's why I do think British people, to understand their own history, should take an interest in Australia, because of all the colonies that we created, all the new nations we created, Australia from the very beginning was a government project. It wasn't like India, where you have a private company got a government monopoly, got a monopoly by the king to build its own empire by itself, which we then had to annex when they run it in when they after the Great Mutiny. Or America was usually run on most territories. of America run the same way, at least initially. The colonization was done by private companies, but Australia was a government project from the very beginning. Because prisons are usually government projects, and I bring up the word prisons. I mean, I think this is actually where it all begins. The controversy and problem with Australian history, the historical problem, is you mentioned the massacres and stuff. Well, actually, the original problem, the original people who were unhappy with Australian history, was the convict system and transportation. And people, that's why John West essentially falsified Tasmanian history by saying that this is the Tasmanian chap, by saying that the convicts mostly died out, right? Because they weren't able to weren't enough women. They didn't get women, so the convict heritage died out and was not genetically present in subsequent generations of Australia. It's false. It's completely false. The convict heritage was not only true, not only real, but it was actually positive. I know that's maybe something many Australians. I don't know how they feel about it. I know people like to research their convict ancestry, but it seems there's also a lot of negativity about the nature of that system. And what I'd like to point out is that actually that system was very successful. You can see it by its fruits. That very quickly Australia became a free and economically successful society. Within mere decades of the end of transportation, Australia had for a brief window, had the highest standard of living in the world. Actually overtook America for a short time in the mid to late 19th century. So from the controversy of the convict system, controversy of the things you mentioned, the Aboriginals, these things from step by step, with each new generation, people have found new reasons to be unhappy with Australian history. And that is a great misfortune, because actually, if you judge it by its fruits, these people, both the convicts, British administrators, Royal Navy officers taking on governorship jobs, they created one of the most remarkable societies on the planet, one of the most remarkably successful societies on the planet, and did it very quickly. Australia became a modern, developed country far more quickly than America did. The youth of America was much, much longer than Australia's.
Yeah, 100%. Maybe we will go through some of the key scenes from Australian history, and then if we have time, we can branch into some broader colonial scenes, British
Sure.
colonial scenes. But maybe we'll start from the beginning. What would you say? Because for an Australian nationalist, you could imagine that our country being founded originally as a prison colony might be a source of perhaps shame. I don't know if that's a commonly felt feeling. It's not. It's definitely not something that I necessarily have to contend with. I don't personally really have any problem with it, but I can imagine for some they would think that that's a low class thing. What would be your defence of the original convict settlers as well as the British soldiers that came across to Australia?
All right. So there's a few points to be made there. First, let's talk about the convicts themselves. The convicts themselves didn't necessarily, it's called them low class. They generally were from the lower class of Britain, but in Australia they made good. That's the key thing. I'll take one case. Okay, Samuel Terry. I don't know if he's well known in Australia as a historical figure, but he was transported
I
to
don't
New
think
South
he is.
Wales.
No.
No, it was transported to New South Wales for a very horrific crime, and brace yourselves, please. His crime was truly horrendous. He stole 400 pairs of socks. Um, what
He
we
must have
have to
been
bear
pretty
in mind.
cold, hey?
Yeah,
I mean, he was living in the
clo-
UK. Is it really that miserable up there? He must be.
part of the context to understand there is that clothes in the UK at that time in history were expensive to make, right? So it was stealing high value goods, and he got sent to. So theft was a capital crime in Britain at the time, and he got commuted to transportation instead of being hung, right? And so he goes to New South Wales, and yet once there, he's working. I can't remember if he was on the second. I think he was on the second fleet. I'd have to double check that. But by the time he died, he was known as the Rothschild of Botany Bay, not because of his religious or ethnic persuasion, but because he became the richest man in Australia, and probably the richest person anywhere between the Cape of Good Hope and Chile in the southern hemisphere. I don't know who else would be competing, and he did that by through land, through leasing, through money lending. Hence the comparison with the Rothschilds. Through opening, he started opening businesses, running businesses for British officers who themselves didn't want to do business because that was not suitable to their class, but needed to make money because they weren't making good money in Australia, and so they would pay someone like a convict like Samuel Terry to do it, be a front man for them basically. But then after doing that for a while, he was able to reinvest the money in his own ventures and became an incredibly rich man. Now you might think he's an extreme case. Oh, sure, but other people, other convicts, the first convict the first person to brew beer in Australia was a convict. Oh God, I forget his name now. James. I'd have to double
Was it
check his name,
Squire?
but yeah, there's a brand still to Australia today named after him, right?
That's how I remembered it.
Yeah, James Squire, and so he's a convict. He was on First Fleet, I believe, and he started brewing as a side business while still a convict. Okay, and he was even flogged during this time. You know, the classic terrible treatment that these people are supposed to get, but it didn't stop him developing his business, becoming wealthy, and his grandson would become Premier of New South Wales. I believe the first Australian-born Premier of New South Wales. New South Wales. So from within 3 generations, going from convict to political power, I think that's pretty good. So you can't say to me these guys were all it was just a disaster for these people. They did well. Okay, not every single individual, but as a whole, they did successfully. And actually, if you take the population as a whole, they were eating better than people in Britain. Their children were growing up taller. There were complaints that doctors or people were saying that doctors didn't have enough work to do in New South Wales because the people were too healthy. These people had a good life and they made good use of it. Okay, so it doesn't mean everything was
That's a
nice by a
phenomenon
modern
that
standard.
persisted even until the Second World War, I believe, when Australian troops were interacting more with other troops from the Anglosphere, and it was somewhat remarked that the Australian troops were taller and
Yeah,
sometimes in a lot better health than those from the old continent.
absolutely, absolutely. It's absolutely the case. So Australia was good for these people. Now, that it was good doesn't necessarily make it just. You might say it's still an injustice to send someone to the other side of the world, but you know they were criminals. I mean, they stealing socks. How do you feel if someone stole 400 pairs of your socks? Maybe so they had to punish them somehow. And in Britain at the time, we had something called the Bloody Code introduced in the late 17th century. Sorry, which was a series of acts that made more and more crimes a capital offence. So we were hanging a lot of people. And people in Britain actually became uncomfortable with this. Judges didn't like doing it. Juries didn't like sentencing people. They would sometimes let people off, not because they were innocent, but because they didn't feel this person deserved to hang. Transportation gave the legal system in the UK a chance to actually be more just, to hang less people. So instead of seeing it's easy to see transportation as harsh by our standards, but by their standards, there's actually a way to be more merciful. And by after a couple of decades of transportation, people in Britain were complaining that this was no punishment at all. You send these people out to Australia and they're getting land. At least in the first couple of decades, when they finished their terms of transportation, they were given land. Even on the first fleet, people were being given land. Sometimes some were given early pardons or tickets to leave. Getting land. Well, you didn't get land if you were committed a crime and stayed in the UK. You didn't get land after being hanged at the gallows. So there were people actually complaining, rather than it being unjust in the sense of being too harsh, it was actually not harsh enough. It was encouraging crime. So on that point of view, again, I don't see the crime or the sense that this is something terrible that happened. It certainly wasn't terrible for those individuals, and if the fact that they were then able to rise up and make this great society, I think is itself uh, worthy of praise. Now, you also asked about the other people involved. You mentioned the British soldiers. It would be wrong, I think, and I
Or
see this.
perhaps more so the officer class, or those
Well,
who were responsible for guarding the convicts in the new land.
yeah, okay. Well, officers didn't personally guard, and they actually had a problem from the very early days of the first settlement at Port Jackson. Arthur Phillip needed the Marines, right? It was Marines initially who were supposed to guard the convicts, but the Marines didn't want to do it, right? A big problem. They actually felt it was beneath them. These guys, mostly veterans of the American War, and felt that standing around in the Antipodes looking at people digging trenches was not suitable work for such serious warriors, and so were very unwilling to do it. And so, actually, one consequence of that unwillingness was that very early on, Arthur Phillip had to get convicts to watch other convicts. There's another way in which convict life is very surprising, that convicts very quickly had to have some kind of authority given to them. The soldiers just did not see that as suitable. Rather, what the soldiers actually wanted to do was, if they could, make some money, which they could do with Samuel Terry, as an example I've already mentioned, where they would pay men like him to do front businesses for them, importing goods that were then sold to free settlers or to convicts. There's a very famous case in Tasmania, a guy called Edward Lord, who who was selling kangaroo meat. He was employing convicts to hunt kangaroos and then selling the meat to other settlers. At that point, only other convicts, and to the to the government store. Sorry, selling it to the government's, because the convicts were getting their food from the central government store, so they had to buy it from men like Edward Lord. So Edward Lord was making money from the British taxpayer, actually, which was that to provide kangaroo meat, which was hunted by convicts, and he then paid the convicts for that. So convicts themselves were making money, Edward Lord was making a lot of money, and the person who was losing out was actually the British taxpayer. So whether you think that's top quality, good behavior or not, I don't think these guys represented some great sinister force in Australian history. They weren't. It wasn't all about them trying to abuse convicts. They usually just wanted to make some money from convicts, and the way they made money from convicts was by paying them to do labor, such as I mentioned, hunting kangaroos in Van Diemen's Land.
Yeah, 100%. So that actually that leads me on to probably one of my favorite episodes from early Australian colonial history. Although if you lived during the time, I can't imagine it would have been too fantastic. Which was the lead up to and the act itself of the Rum Rebellion. So that involved basically the Marines. Over time, they grew more and more corrupt under the leadership of the guy, his name slips my mind, unfortunately, one of the governors of New South Wales. But immediately preceding him was then Governor Macquarie, who steps in and actually does a lot of work to transform Australia, well, at least set Australia on the path towards what it has become today. Or, at least he greatly developed the colony that he was put in charge of in New South Wales. So he's often called the father of Australia because he started calling this continent by that name. He also worked hard to develop a path to sort of citizenship. It wasn't citizenship quite, but to respectable freeman status for the convicts, so that they could eventually start to form a real colony here and not remain purely a penal colony out here in Australia. So that particular episode, is that something that you're familiar with, Owen?
Yes, absolutely. Macquarie is a very impressive figure, but I don't think that starts with him. Actually, I think
No, it
from day
doesn't. He
one,
sort of finishes it, doesn't he?
Arthur Phillip really impressed me. He's the person in Australian history who most made the biggest personal impression on me. He made so many good decisions. So I don't know. I assume all your Australian listeners will know, but I don't know if other nationalities might not be aware. Arthur Phillip was the first governor of New South Wales. He led the first fleet that landed convicts, about 1,200 people at Port Jackson, which would become Sydney. And from the get-go, he made very positive decisions. He was the first person to give conditional pardons, what would become known as ticket of leave, to convicts if they behaved well and been responsible. They would get land grants. So they could turn themselves over time into free farmers. He also was the person who decided, he recommended personally in his correspondence with the British government, that he would not support the importation of slaves into New South Wales. So Australia would avoid some of the problems that we see in other former British colonies like Caribbean or America. He also made the decision ultimately that they would not bring in foreign women, which was actually an initial idea, that they would bring in women from Tahiti, very popular with the Royal Navy in those days, these women. And had they done so en masse, which was an initial idea, then early New South Wales would have become more like the Pitcairn Islands, or more like Norfolk Island, with a mixed race population. But instead, he obviously decided against that, even though that was in the initial plan. And so the kind of Australia we know was possible because of him.
So that's Governor Arthur Phillip, who was the first governor of New South Wales. And yeah, he is often remarked upon not only for his skill in governorship, but also in transporting the convicts over on the First Fleet to Australia. He adopted a lot of the discoveries of Captain James Cook in terms of sanitation and nutrition, and he was able to keep the crew very much in order and safe and disease-free on their way over, and avoided a lot of casualties as a result of that. Unfortunately, that was not something that was carried over to the Second Fleet, which experienced mass casualties. Interestingly, that was actually run by a private company as opposed to the government who ran the British government who
Yeah.
ran the First Fleet. Is that anything that you'd like to speak about, Owen?
Oh, I just want to say, I used to be, 15 years ago, I used to be a bit of a Ron Paul enthusiast, a bit of a libertarian. I used to think of, what's the Reagan line? I'm here from the government, and I'm from the government, and I'm here to help. It's the most scary words a business can ever hear. I used to think governments always. I used to adopted this line, I suppose, from American libertarianism that government programs always fail. Australia has to be the most successful government program of all time. The British government set out to build a colony on the other side of the globe, and within 100 years, it turned into a very successful country. But not even within 100 years. I mean, despite the problems they had in the early decades, you mentioned how well Arthur Phillips managed the journey over, and that's absolutely right. They did have problems after arriving. They had problems growing wheat. They had problems feeding themselves. Though heroic efforts were made to resolve that. John Hunter, who would later be a governor of New South Wales, I think the second after Arthur Phillip, he circumnavigated the globe, leaving Port Jackson to go to the Cape, South Africa, buy food and bring it back to New South Wales to prevent the colony starving. It has to be the most roundabout and longest grocery shopping trip in all of human history. So much positive and remarkably good decisions were made by these people, by Phillips, by Philip, by Hunter, by Macquarie, that it just seems bonkers to me to then go on Twitter or X. And something I often see it since Australians started interacting with me about Australian history on Twitter. I started chatting with a few people, started following a few Australians. There's this dichotomy made between the convicts and the officers that I don't agree with. The convicts in the military. First of all, we didn't mention the lower ranks of the military, but actually for them, they were the same social class as the convicts. And an additional problem, any attempt at trying to impose any kind of proper prison discipline was that British soldiers, rankers that is, often got on well with the convicts and often wanted to marry what female convicts there were and stuff like this. So it was very hard to get them to actually behave like in a prison kind of setup. But instead of seeing these sides as opposed, it's clear that most of the time these two forces were symbiotic. They were actually cooperating very well, and they both contributed enormously to making this Australian country. Rather than seeing them as opposed forces, it's better to see them as two facets of an embryonic society.
That is an unnecessary divide that often springs up between Australian nationalists today, which is those who fall on the supposedly Angloist, I say that in quotes, side of the argument, and perhaps that's represented by people at the British Australian community today, as opposed to those who take more inspiration from the sort of working class beginnings that we see in the convict labourers that were brought over to Australia, and those perhaps describe themselves as nativists today. The Australian Natives Association might be an example of people who side more so with that element of our history. But I don't see any division here either. Like you're saying, these two were both necessary in the creation of Australia. They both were intertwined, and in the end, they ended up growing into the same country. Once those convicts were freed after they'd served their sentence, they would go on to become freemen who worked farms and so on, whereas the soldiers were also granted land grants and given a salary, and were also commuted to allow them to become ordinary settlers and workers. And in the end, an organic country sprang out of these two supposedly distinct groups, which, I mean, it hasn't left any discernible divide today, except I suppose in nationalist opinion in the modern
In
day,
imagination.
or in ideology, I think, which is a very minor deviation that doesn't even need to exist. I think that that's something that, with a greater study of history, we can realize. And yeah, no, it was a good point that you made, Owen. So we'll continue on in our story. Actually, just quickly, to make a little diversion, you were saying how the founding of Australia is an example of a highly successful government project, and I have to agree, and I'll contrast that perhaps with the colonisation of India, which
Hmm.
was a vastly different project, which to much to everyone's complaint today across the political spectrum, and especially in the third world in countries like India, they say that the British East India Company, which operated that colony, was harsh and committed many atrocities. And I won't contest that. There were clearly injustices on both sides, though, I will note. There's the Black Hole of Calcutta immediately comes to mind, which was a massacre of British soldiers by Indians. So it wasn't all just atrocities going one way. However, I will say that one inefficiency perhaps you could say, was that the East India Company was so concerned with its own profit that it didn't put any interest into cultivating a government that could look after the country into the future and make it a sustainable project. And if you're looking purely at it from a cost benefit sort of a perspective, in the end, it ended up being a massive negative, as India splitting away from the empire caused a lot of headaches and rumblings all across the rest of the world. And that was the first link of empire to break after World War II. Now, that's just a short diversion, but we'll jump back to the colony of New South Wales, and we can continue all the way through to Federation, where all the colonies in Australia became one and became a federated Australia, one country under one government. However, I think it's worth noting, and on the note that I just mentioned of the India example, is that those who were losing out, supposedly, in all of this process were the Australian Indigenous, who were here from many thousands of years ago. There's much dispute over how many thousands that is, but they were here long before. Now, a lot has been made about their dispossession from the land, the fact that they were treated as though they didn't exist. Owen, can you tell me, is that story of history that we're told in Australia and across the Western world, is that true? Is that representative of what actually happened?
Well, they definitely didn't win. History does have losers, and it's not nice and it's not pleasant. I sometimes think when we talk about these colonial situations, if the ancestors of the English, I mean the original Anglo-Saxons coming over from Germany, Hengist and Horther, the guys who led the Anglo-Saxon invasions against post-Roman Britain, if they would lay in bed at night weeping for the fate of the native Celts, they probably didn't. And uh, and yet, actually, in Australia, from the very beginning, there has been concern for the Aboriginals. At least in theory, at least people have generally been interested in them and hoped for some kind of positive resolution for them. Hasn't always been possible. Disasters do happen, and the coming. I wouldn't want to sugarcoat anything. The coming of the First Fleet in New South Wales did seem to result in a smallpox outbreak that hurt lots of people. When they finally got to make friends with um, a few Aboriginals, like Benelong, for example, they noted his pockmarked face from the disease that had been brought in. There was a tendency to relate in early Australian historiography, in the early Australian historical writing, to blame the fate of the Aboriginals specifically on the convicts, actually. So it actually relates to the first point where the first black mark in Australian history was the convicts. That was used to excuse Australia or the colonial process experience generally by trying to pin it on just one group, which is really unjust. Actually, in my opinion, the convicts can't take solitary blame for the fate of a people when you have these two civilizations meeting each other. I think whatever the social situation of the British when they arrived, when these two civilizations are going to meet, that it's gonna end badly. I don't have like some nice story to say where if we'd done it a bit differently, things would have gone better. Some of the leftists might say, "Well, we should have stayed home." I this isn't how history doesn't work that way. Yeah, energetic civilizations expand outwards, and I'm not sorry. I'm not sorry that my civilization expanded outward and that my people sought new opportunities abroad and sought to defend the interests of Britain by expansion. It was these because that's an angle we didn't talk about. It's like, why did we settle New South Wales? A big part was to block out the French. So if it wasn't us, it would have been the French. The French were very interested in the South Seas. As it turned out, they had to make do with New Caledonia, which, amazingly they still have. But anyway, in any case, once Europeans of any type arrived in Australia, there was going to be conflict, and it was going to end bad. Were there some ways it could have gone a little better? The British themselves, they tried to treat it so that the Aboriginals had British legal protection, because it was a little of a funny legal situation in Australia where almost the entirety of the mainland of Australia was declared British territory by James Cook, right? Which meant anyone living in it, whether they knew it or not, was a British subject. So was supposed to have British legal protections. And Arthur Phillip himself tried hard to enforce that as much as he could. He even invited Aboriginals to the colony to watch a convict be flogged, a convict who'd been in a fight or even killed an Aboriginal. But as I mentioned, because of the lax discipline of the military in early colonial Australia, the inability to control the conflicts, it was impossible to prevent these groups of people meeting together. Which Arthur Phillips initially said in his correspondence with the British government before setting out, that he hoped to keep convicts and Aboriginals completely separate. It's just impossible. So once they did meet, they did fight. They fought over goods. They fought over fishing goods. They fought over women, and so conflict became part of the Australian national colonial story. The Aboriginals put up a good fight. I mean, I kind of feel it's sad when we focus on people as victims and just say, "Oh, so sad for them." It's such a tragedy. It is a tragedy. It is sad that. It is always sad for people to lose, but they had some brave people. They had from the very beginning a figure who stands as Pamu. I don't know. I have no idea if I said his name correctly. He was the first fighter against the British, and instead of just focusing on
He's quite an interesting character in his own light, and
yeah,
I agree that he has been sort of overshadowed by the sort of sniveling victim mentality of. Well, I don't say that in like the conservative establishment sort of way, but there definitely is some sort of a victim narrative way that they tell Aboriginal history, and that Aboriginals tell their own history. When someone like Pamulwe, although he was opposed to my interests as somebody who has British ancestry and was opposed to the British at the time, it's someone that we could respect as a warrior for the fighting that he did. Although I can't say that I've read hugely into it. I mean, he was injured and shot many times to a point where the British believed that he was bulletproof, actually, and that bullets couldn't kill this man. And he actually had been shot through many, many times, but had just survived. And he conducted a guerrilla war for, I believe, a decade on the British before finally dying and having his skull sent off to England. But, I mean, that is something that just isn't really commemorated by Aboriginals today. Instead, they moan endlessly about the harms that were done to them rather than the heroes of their people. I don't know, and I'd say the same thing on our side, or I'd say our side in quotes, but on the British side of things, on the Australian perspective, the white Australian perspective, is that so many are so snivelling about the British interest in expanding across the world and asserting our interests everywhere and outcompeting our enemies. And that is something that is completely foreign to even I'd say our grandfathers and every generation before them. The idea that you would jeer at your own civilization for succeeding and for being strong and being powerful and spreading civilization across the world and Christianity is just such a I suppose it's so unnatural. It's so unnatural for a man,
weak.
especially. It is weak,
Yeah,
but
no,
it is
no.
just,
I
it's
was
very
thinking the same thing about
gross.
man.
But sorry, yeah,
It's
I'll let you
gross.
continue on. I interrupted you, but yeah,
No,
no,
no, I
I just wanted
interrupted
to
you
point
there.
out that you absolutely no. But I just wanted to point out that you're absolutely correct that this tradition of hating on our own history and same from the Aboriginals as well on downplaying their own fearlessness, well, of their warriors or some of them at least, is something that I don't believe is a positive development. But please continue on.
Well, actually, I think you had it spot on there. It's very feminine, right? It's not very masculine. That's why I mentioned the example of Hengist and Hawthorne. They found the semi-mythical founders of Anglo-Saxon England. They didn't lie in bed at night crying over the dispossession of the Celts. It had been so pathetic and weak to do so. So feminine. It beggars belief that
It's
people
like
do that today.
crying for your own football team winning because the other team had to lose or something like that. And we can say, oh yeah, no, they had a tough go at it. They had, they didn't do as well as they could have, and they had some good players, but unfortunately, it just didn't work out for them. But it's still, I mean, you're going to cheer when your team wins. It's a very estranged thing for people to be jeering at their own side and shouting prerogatives at their own side for winning. Anyway, I'll let you get back to the narrative.
Well,
You're up to the resistance in against the
yeah.
colonials.
Well, I'll say this also. I mean, who's going to cry for us? Who's crying for the loss of Parramatta and for London? Yeah, who's crying for that? I hope I pronounced Parramatta right. I mean, the suburb of Sydney, or this part of Sydney that was founded by Arthur Phillip. It was a government farm, and now it's mostly populated by people from outside the Anglosphere, shall we say? Is anyone crying for the dispossession of white Australians? Is anyone crying for the British who've lost territory in our home country? Right? I mean, I don't think anyone's weeping for us. So, and it'd be kind of pathetic and weak if they were doing so, right? So I don't really support that. Back to the Aboriginals. They fought. Yeah, they fought a protracted series of protracted guerrilla campaigns, and often did better than you might expect. I was particularly impressed in Van Diemen's Land or Tasmania. There was a time where the British were legitimately threatened. We're so accustomed to thinking of the Aboriginals as massively outnumbered, but actually, for a good decade or so in Tasmania, the Aboriginals outnumbered the British, and the British lacked a lot of stuff that colonial forces often had, particularly horses. So horses were not a big feature of early Australia. Whereas if you read about the conquest of the Incas and the Aztecs by the Spanish, horses were massive, like more important than things like guns, because with the horses, with the mobility, you could traverse these difficult terrain much more rapidly. They were intimidating and scary to a society that had never seen them. But in British Australia, they just didn't have this resource on a large enough scale. So British soldiers and convicts and anyone seeking to fight the Aboriginals, or for that matter, fight the bushrangers who dominated the central much of central Tasmania at the time, they had to learn basic bushcraft. They had to trawl through the woods on foot. So that the Aboriginals had a good go at fighting, and even though in Tasmania they ultimately paid the ultimate price and were completely defeated, far more completely than anywhere, it's partly because there was so much resistance, so much courage, so much that's admirable and commendable. I mean, I'm what's the right word I want to say? I'm glad my country has had decent enemies in its history, right? They're not all just pushovers, and we shouldn't see them that way.
That's a good phrase. And maybe we can just pause from the telling of the history for a moment to remark on perhaps, well, I'll just say the whole process you're describing here is known as the Frontier Wars. So that's the process of British pushing into the interior of the land, driving back the Aboriginals where they resisted, and colonizing and settling those places. Now, that in some ways it's not quite correct to describe them as wars per se, because oftentimes Aboriginals were the aggressors, and the British were responding against what were basically, because you said much earlier that all the Aboriginals were considered subjects of the British Crown, and
Yes.
that is actually true, because oftentimes the Aboriginals would attack British encampments, and they were treated as though they were criminals more so than an aggressor. So, for example, I'll say it was very common for Aboriginals at that time, or the warriors, to kill British civilians and farmers as opposed to combating any military target from the British. And there's good reason for this. Maybe partly because they didn't see the land as theirs per se. The Aboriginals had a spiritual belief that they were owned by the land rather than being owners of the land. And so the idea that they were fighting for their country isn't quite true, actually. They weren't patriotic warriors necessarily, though they were in some terms sometimes fighting for access to hunting areas or waterways or something like that, or perhaps even spiritually significant sites. But they weren't necessarily fighting in the way that we'd think of soldiers, say, fighting for their country or fighting for their people or something like that. So the Aboriginals oftentimes, aside from defending key waterways or something like that, they were often attacking the British settlements and civilian targets for the purpose of obtaining luxury goods. So I'd say the historian Keith Windshuttle, he's actually gone through and analysed the court documents of the day and looked at the individual cases of these attacks by Aboriginals on British and the British response to that. And he added up, he tabulated what was stolen by the Aboriginals in these times. And most of the time, it was actually luxury goods, meaning they were stealing sugar, bed sheets, things like that, things that they actually didn't need to survive, that they hadn't needed to survive for many, many years, but that they liked, that they actually preferred about British civilization. It was actually something introduced by the British to them in the hopes that being introduced to these luxury goods would actually civilize the people and make them see the advantages of British civilization. But yeah, unfortunately, that just led to them getting addicted, or maybe not addicted, but very much desiring those goods and attacking civilians for them, British civilians, and stealing them. So the British would then respond in turn, the soldiers, by arresting and sometimes executing, sometimes I guess, going and fighting those Aboriginals who were acting criminally in this way and breaking British law as it could be best communicated to them, and also protecting their own settlements and protecting their own civilizations. Now, earlier in the podcast, right at the beginning, to tie this all together, we did mention that oftentimes British history, or sorry, Australian history, and maybe the colonial period as well, is seen as quite boring, uninteresting. We don't have the civil wars and the coups that other countries have. We don't have, we have actually a remarkably peaceful history, and I don't say that in a bad way, although it does make the study of it maybe less interesting. But what has been robbed from Australians is the ability to look at the frontier wars and see that as our campaign and that civilized the country, and really cheer for our team in that. That's a remarkably interesting part of our history, but it's looked on with such shame because it's seen as a black stain on our people, on our country. So perhaps the frontier wars and looking at them more in depth could be the key to making Australian history more interesting. There's your conflict, there's your resolution, and so that's something that I think could be introduced into schooling to make it more interesting. But Owen, I know you've got something to say. What did you want to jump into?
Well,
I've been yapping.
there's so much there. There's a great explanation and speech. There's so much I'd like to comment on there because it was a lot. First of all, about the British subject status. I know I mentioned this previously, and you brought it up again. I do think the Aboriginals seem to get a raw deal from this, right? So James Cook arrives in New South Wales, and he declares, I forget the exact. It's not literally the entirety of mainland Australia, but the 2/3 or 3/4 of it is British territory. So all the Aboriginals within me are British subjects. So yes, they are legally seen by the British as criminals, but they very rarely got the kind of protection that British subjects should have had. And one consequence of them being British subjects, it was never possible for them to have any kind of treaty with the British. Now, that might not be I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing, but I know that this has come up recently in Australian politics. Australians compare with New Zealand and Canada, the United States, but there's lots of treaties with the Indigenous peoples, and that was possible because the Indigenous peoples and all of those places were assumed to be foreign political entities. So they could be a treaty of annexation and subject status for them. Whereas the Aboriginals, they were British subjects in most cases before they even laid eyes on a white man. So that made the resolution for them a bit tougher. There was the one attempt at making a treaty with these guys was done by a private enterprise. I mentioned how most of Australia was a government project. There was one attempt to kind of get out of that mode. It was by John Batman and the Port Phillip Association, and they tried to make a treaty. The British government rejected the treaty. They didn't recognize the treaty, and the Aboriginals had to make do with being British government, British subject status, which wasn't necessarily the best start off for them. The luxury goods angle, when you started mentioning that, I kind of wish I mentioned it earlier, because actually one thing that struck me about Australia is how important luxury goods have always been to the Australian national story. The from the very quite early days, not quite the first decade, but from quite early on, convicts were getting luxury goods on a scale unimaginable in Britain. They were getting tea, they were getting rum, they were getting good white bread with imported flour because the wheat they were originally growing wasn't growing well. They were eating more meat. So they were getting tobacco. They were just the stuff these people were getting. And the Aboriginals are kind of the same, right? It's actually a connecting thread of them both. That luxury goods just come up again and again. So much so that, as you mentioned, even your one sort of revolution or coup d'état, even that gets named after a luxury good that these people are enjoying, namely rum. And finally, just that last point. I hope I've not distracted people from it, because the last point was so key about getting people excited about Australian history. Is the frontier wars the way to generate that interest? Certainly, the frontier wars would give you a better idea of I would say the martial nobility of these people. I mean, they had their own martial culture. They fought in their own particular way, the way that's not really understandable to Europeans. They engaged in a sort of more ceremonial form of warfare that has disappeared from European culture many centuries ago. Though if you go far back enough, we certainly did have it. Yeah, that's one way. But I actually wanted to say this about the level of interest, or what makes Australian history exciting. Not everything has to be about war. And I sometimes think Australian history, for me, I got really excited, really interested in it. And I thought of an analogy. I hope this doesn't go over people's heads, but an analogy from computer games. If you think of American colonial history, is like Age of Empires, where you have a game map, and there's multiple bases on that map for different teams, and you win by annihilating those other bases and controlling the whole map. And that's what Britain did in North America, right? Australian history is not like that. Australian history is more like Sim City, or a base building game where there is excitement and challenge, and millions of people play those style of games. But the excitement and challenge and difficulty and drama is from the internal dynamics and dealing with an exceptional environment, and coping with contradictions that develop later because of decisions made earlier on. That actually,
It's the city planner's dream, really.
yeah, exactly. That's kind of how I ended up looking at it, and so that became exciting for me, even though I'm someone who's really into military history. And I've got a great book on the frontier wars. I'm not ruling that out as being part of the story, uh, but Australian history should be taken on its own terms, and it is exceptional in many ways in having uh, less of that type of thing that maybe people want, but go into it expecting a different kind of drama, and you will get it. There is a great story there. It's not always military. Of course, Australia does have a military history outside, and there is surprising features. I say surprising. It always strikes me as odd. This maybe getting beyond the colonial era a bit, but there's always this sense of it starts in the colonial era. There's always this sense of insecurity in Australia, that at any point the other side are going to turn up and nab up your base, and then Australia would be like Age of Empires rather than Sim City. From the very beginning, this because the French are going to turn up. We rush. I forget the chap's name, but we rush a chap over to Tasmania to build a settlement there because the French are sailing a ship around the area. We're constantly expanding because of the French, because why the French are going to turn up. But it never happens, right? And then that extends. That kind of sense of insecurity goes on later in the 20th century with the fears the Japanese are going to invade. Even today, I suppose, with fears about concerns about China, and this sense of insecurity always seems to be present in Australian history, and yet it never materializes, with the exception of one torpedo attack, right? I think in one air raid in World War II, and I think in World War I, a couple of Afghan camel drivers attacking a train station. I think in I forget where exactly, but that's basically the sum total of foreign attack on Australia. It's not a lot, certainly not by a European standard. And so, instead of expecting Age of Empires, expect SimCity, and you won't be so disappointed.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true on a sort of an academic level, I think. But I think throughout, our past demonstrates this, but it's usually men who are most interested in history, right? And what do we want to hear about? We want to hear about the battles and the fights and the great warriors, right? It's usually not the women that are really into history, although maybe that's changing because of the nature of humanities programs these days and who controls them. But to get Australians interested in history, you have to get the men interested in history. And to get the men
Mm.
interested in history, you got to tell about, and not in a totally like shameful way where you're saying, oh, these poor Aboriginals were slaughtered and the disgusting Europeans did it, and for this we must pay reparations for the rest of our days. Instead, say, no, there were honourable warriors on both sides. Yes, one side won, and that's something that we should be proud of. We shouldn't be ashamed of that. But also we can look at it with a level of respect that perhaps doesn't. I don't think exists today. I think it's because today the young white men aren't interested in siding with the side that are the killers and the aggressors and the colonial warmongers or something like that. And the Aboriginals and perhaps the more left wing side of things aren't necessarily interested in associate, or maybe the more masculine side of that side of things aren't really interested in associating with the poor helpless victims that put up no defense and died at the sword or something like that. Instead, what you would want is you'd want a situation where people are getting interested because they're going for their own team, kind of. That's all. The great stories have been what characterize our interest in history, or at least the casual or the mass participation in history. Is that something that you agree with, Owen, or am I off track?
Yeah, I do agree with that, and I think it explains some abnormalities about Australia. And this is maybe where I might run the risk of. I don't want to. I think you guys are thick-skinned enough, but the prominence given to someone like John Kelly, he has an exciting life story. Don't get me wrong, but it'd be like in Britain, I don't know, the Craze or something, having such a level of prominence. He's a criminal, and maybe he had some legitimate grievances, and his family were being harassed or whatever. I'm not super expert on the subject, but he seems like he's an unusual national hero. Let's put it that way. And it
Yeah, certainly the Anzacs are more suited. I think they also fill that role for a lot of people.
Good. Well, yeah. For me, as an outsider, they're far more positive figures. Though I suppose for some modern Australians, even some right-wing Australians who are more as you called it, the nativist side, maybe they don't like that as much because they fought for the British Empire or something.
I do. We all sort of. There is across the board, even from apolitical people, at least from white apolitical people, there's a pretty across the board respect for the Anzacs. That's something that we all can agree on. That they played a great role. They made a great sacrifice for our country, even if we shouldn't have been in the war or they were misled or something. They made a great sacrifice and they're heroes. So I think that's certainly more elevated than Ned Kelly. Ned Kelly definitely gets more of a, I guess, maybe a boganish following. I don't know if you have that term in the UK, bogan. It's sort of redneck or lower class. These sort of maybe more working class or on the dole sort of people. Ned Kelly, he shot and stole from police officers. Modern Ned Kelly fans, they collect dole from Centrelink without actually applying for work. That's their crime. That's their rebellion against society. But I digress. Sorry, continue on. I interrupted you once again.
Well, then no, you didn't interrupt me at all. Though I will say this: if you wanted to get pre-Anzacs and get back to the colonial era, which in any case is the era I know more about, there are, even if there's not the kind of maybe it's less military. You mentioned what kind of figures would men be interested in? Like young men getting into Australian history. I want to make it not boring. There are figures that I think would be inspiring. I have been very impressed with two. One of whom, actually, despite what I just said about John Kelly, was a bushranger. Most of the bushrangers don't impress me as individuals. Most of them, they're the ones who didn't make it in some way. The way that Samuel Terry or James Squire did for moving to Australia. But I can appreciate a lovable rogue, and one that struck me is a guy called Michael Howe in Tasmania. He really impressed me, and in fact, there's a biography of him. It's really short, it's like 30 pages long. It's actually Australia's first piece of literature, written in Tasmania, just after this guy was caught and hung. I say first literature. First, I suppose it depends how you define first piece of literature. Because you could say something like Watkin Tench's description of the settlement of Bonnie Bay could be number one, and the other diarists of that settlement. But first Australian. It's certainly the first piece of historiography, and by a guy in Australia for an Australian audience. And this guy, he was a serial running away. He was a Yorkshireman. It's also a connection with me because my mother's family are from Yorkshire. And he ran away from a merchant ship. He ran away from the Royal Navy. He joined the British Army. Ran away from that. Ended up becoming a highwayman in Yorkshire. He's an actual proper criminal. So this idea that it's unjust is another reason why I don't agree with it. Transportation is nationally unjust. This guy clearly deserves some kind of punishment. If you're not going to hang him, what are you going to do? Send him to Van Diemen's Land. And so he gets there. Of course, what does he do when he gets there? He runs away. He joins a gang, a Whitehead gang. He then Whitehead gets killed in a firefight. Right? I mean, blimey, you want some action? They're attacking. They're a bit like Ned Kelly. They were not quite 100 years before, but maybe 80 years before Ned Kelly. So they're attacking police. The local constables' farms and stuff like this. He becomes the leader of the gang. He makes alliances with Aboriginal tribes, and he starts writing letters to the governors, the two different governors of Van Diemen's Land, describing himself as the governor of the woods. Truly, really marking himself out as an authority figure outside of what is still a very narrow pale of settlement for British life. Of course, it all ends badly, and eventually he gets killed in a violent confrontation with people who are essentially bounty hunters. And actually, it's onto this scene you get another figure that really impressed me from early Australian colonial history is John Batman, or Batman. I actually have a theory that he was maybe referred to as Bateman. I've never met anyone even called Batman, but
it would be funny if he
Bateman's-
was Patrick Bateman's predecessor,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
I don't know
exactly.
if we can draw the connection.
I don't know, but in any case, he's a son of a convict. He's one of those other sons of convicts who made good. From New South Wales, ends up going to Van Diemen's Land to be a bounty hunter, hunting for bushrangers, and ends up leading a project to colonize what becomes Melbourne and Victoria as a private adventure. And in so doing, he becomes the only figure in Australian history who has that kind of Cortez or Pizarro or Clive of India start kind of adventuring conqueror kind of story, and he does it. I mean, even though the treaty he draws up with the natives there doesn't get recognized by the British government, his private venture actually does result in the British government having to follow where the settlers have already gone, and leads to the creation of an additional Australian state. Of course, it would have happened eventually anyway, but he's the guy who did it. He's the adventurer. So there's plenty of adventurers in Australian history, men who learned to thrive in the environment. And some did so on the side of just about on the side of respectability, like Batman, and some on the other side, like Michael Howe. So if you want a pantheon of masculine, impressive, sometimes violent men to inspire today's men, well, you have them. You have them in you have plenty of them.
Yeah, exactly. And we've got no shortage at all. And in that way, I see us as a continuation of what was started on the old continent. And I don't see any disconnect there. We created a civilization. We really picked up where the British left off with Federation and what came afterwards as well. It's such a shame that that's sort of going away now, and we're approaching the end of our time. But maybe we can touch a little bit on this effort to decolonize everything, right? This has become a buzzword. It's become quite recognizable. And what's decolonization? Well, it's cutting down statues of our colonial figures, especially Captain Cook, right? He's sort of seen as the symbol of colonialism, even though he had a very limited role in it in Australia. We've had several attempts and successful attempts at cutting down or otherwise vandalising statues of Captain Cook and other colonial figures here in Australia. Also, all of our education systems history education curriculum has been reformed to reflect a more apologetic tone in terms of discussing Australian history, colonial history. It's definitely gone very much to the left, something that was fought against by, I'll mention his name again, people like Keith Windschuttle and also Jeffrey Blaney, but unfortunately to not much avail. So this decolonisation is it's something that I can only see growing more as we have more people, more dissatisfied children and grandchildren of third world colonized peoples arriving in our countries, and also the left becoming more rabid and hateful of the descendants of the colonizers in said countries, in Australia, in the UK, in Canada, America, and across the rest of the world. do you see this as something that is sort of unstoppable and going to continue marching on? And what do you make of all of this decolonization stuff, Owen?
Well, first of all, it's a nonsense term, right? Decolonization uh, became a term in the post-war world to describe the actual political changes on the map, right? Where Britain and France and other European colonies left territories that we previously conquered. That's decolonization. That's an appropriate use of the term. What they're talking about now, if you mentioned attacking statues, but I do think it's a lot more sinister than that. They want a complete aesthetic and cultural change in our public spaces. And it's fundamentally attack. I don't even see it just an attack on our history. I see it as an attack on me personally, actually. When they want to tear down statues of my ancestors, that's an attack on me personally. When they want to make it so that we can walk the streets of England and not see a statue of a white man, that's the way they want to take it, or certainly not a successful 18th century white man, that's an attack. It's not some academic thing. They hate us. Clearly, they hate us. If you're tearing down statues of James Cook, you hate Australia. I don't know why. I don't see any reason to. I don't see any how else to see it. Like it'd be like, oh, I love America, but I hate George Washington. What would that mean? Like you hate the person who made it. You hate the person who led it initially, who made it possible, who gave it a founding ethos. Complete. It's like I love Christianity, but I hate Jesus. I mean, it's nonsensical, right? It's stupid. I don't want to quite compare Cook to Jesus, but you know what I mean. He's as a national founder. He's a key figure. Same with Arthur Phillip. Okay, I saw they vandalized the statue of Arthur Phillip. They tried. I mentioned Batman. There's a park in Melbourne called Batman Park, I think, and they tried to change its name. They didn't succeed actually, but they really tried. All has to go, right? Any memory that this is a land that belonged to your people or to my people in Britain. And the fact that it all has to go, and the fact that it's applied in Britain just shows, I think, really confirms that it's hateful, because you wouldn't talk about decolonization in a non-colonized country, right? Britain was not a colony of the British Empire. Britain was the metropole, and yet they apply decolonization there as a term. They applied it. I think I mentioned this to you a while ago on Twitter, and I plan to talk to. I've got a friend who's a professional focusing. I want to talk to him about this sometime soon. But in Britain, I think it was University of Sheffield. They have some program for finding ways to decolonize English folk music. Now, just think about what that means for a second. English folk music is indigenous. How do you decolonize something that's indigenous? The equivalent in Australia would be, oh, well, I'll decolonize the didgeridoo. I'll say you've got to have a mixed ethnic composition on your didgeridoo squad or whatever they call them. But in Britain, of course they don't mean remove the foreign elements. That's what decolonization should mean: the removal of a foreign authority, or perhaps a foreign population. I'm not saying that should actually be done in Australia, of course, but when they apply it in Britain, it just shows how vacuous their use is, and it's just an attack, because when they say decolonizing English folk music, they mean make English folk music more multi-ethnic. That is to say, make it less English, less of the folk of the people. It's a complete nonsense term. So I don't take the term itself very seriously. They just hate us.
Yeah, exactly. It's not really something that needs to be even addressed on the intellectual level, to be honest, although absolutely we can go there if need be. But I think this is a good place to bring the episode in for a landing. We'll wrap up soon. But yes, the end goal of decolonization is the same kind of end goal as decolonization in, I think it was Haiti, right? Where in the end, the Haitians ended up executing all of the white French that they could find. And that I can't imagine that's going to be much different considering the language of those in Australia who use this, that talk about decolonization and commit acts of vandalism and activism which call for it. So it is basically the reduction of Australians in Australia as much as possible, whether that be through mass immigration, lowering birth rates, pouring shame onto white Australians for their history, and generally just trying to, or even making economic conditions so untenable to having large families or families at all, that once again you're reducing the population of Australians in Australia, and it's something that's taking place across all of the Anglosphere, across all of Europe, and so this is really the end goal of decolonization. And hence why everything that we discussed in this episode is so important to know about, to be able to defend our history, really sort of knocks away the pillar of support underlying all of their narrative about why white people are evil, why white Australians, why Britons are evil, which is that actually history is a lot more complex. Australians and British did a lot of good in their colonisation, although we need to look at it realistically. It wasn't all rah rah. We did everything the best ever, but also it's not a cause for us to hate ourselves or need to go extinct. Thank you for joining me this week, Owen. Where can everyone find more of your work? And you can add a wrapping up remark if you'd like.
All right. Well, on the topic of decolonisation, on Westminster Abbey, our national church where we crown our kings, there was a little statue on the over the entrance recently put there, maybe about 10 years ago, of Martin Luther King. I do wonder if one day, after some dramatic political changes, if we will decolonize Westminster Abbey and what that might mean after we have a dramatic ideological change in Britain and the West generally. And on terms of Australia, I hope, we talked about lots of little different areas of Australian history, of colonial Australian history. I hope we've demonstrated. I think we have demonstrated that it's a fascinating topic. I'm sure the both of us could go on much longer. And so, if you're a history enthusiast, get into Australia. There's no reason not to get into Australian history. There's some great Australian writers. You mentioned Geoffrey Blainley. I really enjoyed John Hurst as well. They're great. Geoffrey Blainley is my favorite, actually. My favorite Australian historian, frankly, my favorite Australian writer. Get into Australian
Keith
history.
Windshuttle is a must as well. I recommend for everyone. Absolutely.
So, yeah, there's a lot to choose from. It really is impressive. So, get into Australian history. Put that on your reading list. There's important stories in there. And in terms of finding my work, you can find me at the Colonial Pride Review on YouTube. I'm also on X if you fancy chatting. Feel free to come see my videos on other historical topics.
And as always, all links will be in the description, so make sure you go follow the Colonial Pride Review everywhere that you can find it. Also follow the nationalobserver.co. That's where you can find all of my work and my fellow writers at the National Observer, all of our previous podcast episodes, and any new content that we might put out. So that's the nationalobserver.co. If you subscribe, you can have it all sent straight to your inbox, and you won't miss a thing that we do. Thank you very much for joining me this week, Owen. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.